agents of change. We reclaim ourselves, our power and identities, and support one another to facilitate our collective healing. We shine light on equitable, inclusive practices to embrace transformation. By taking responsibility for the next generations, we honor the sacrifice of those who came before us and the resilience and strength of our communities. It is in this context that we offer this series on social trauma. And it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our presenter. Sarah Peyton is a certified trainer of nonviolent communication and neuroscience educator. She integrates brain science and the use of resonant language to heal trauma and nourish self-worth with exquisite gentleness. She teaches and lectures internationally, and she's the author of the book, Your Resonant Self, guided meditations and exercises to engage your brain's capacity for healing. She's currently at work on a second book on the relational neuroscience of the unconscious contract. So welcome, Sarah.
Good. There we go. I'm so honored to be invited to bring what I have for you, Mercedes. Thank you for inviting me. All right, and welcome and good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to be here, and what I'd love is, if possible, if Mercedes, if you would be willing to keep an eye on the chat, because I won't be able to see the chat when I'm working with the slides. We will have some presentation of material, and please ask questions in the chat. There are 108 participants right now, so we'll let you mostly ask questions in the chat. If you need to raise your hand, then I think that Mercedes will be able to keep an eye on that as well. But if nobody's noticing you, then put it in the chat that you have your hand raised, and we'll do what we can to integrate what's happening in your community in response to this material, and bring it back around for you here. So I'll begin with my slides, and then we'll just follow along from there. What do we need to know about social trauma? And I know that you folks are probably my most informed audience that I've ever spoken to about social trauma. So I just was noticing the kind of mission that Mercedes sent me. The culturally specific collaborative invites people of color and white allies to a series of webinars to find common ground and solidarity in times of uncertainty. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the land. In my case, I live along the Columbia River in southern Washington, and this is the country of the Chinook Nation, 5 peoples who are a part of this larger sense of people who have had this land taken from them by false treaty, and they are not even accorded the status of a tribe in our area. So it's a relationship with the land that's very, very fraught with deceit and betrayal, which I experience a lot of sorrow about. So I'm just going to take a moment of silence just to be with that for myself, and I invite you all to be with whatever relationship it is that you have with your land. Your family may have been on the land you live on for centuries, and your family may be like mine, part of the settlers that were part of such an incredible genocide in the western parts of the Americas, well, east as well. But so just and acknowledging the Chinook Nation's ongoing struggles and legal cases and work on every front to be able to both preserve their relationship with this land and preserve the land itself. So, what do we need to know about social trauma? I was thinking a lot about domestic violence in this context as we came together for this talk. And what we do know is we know that domestic violence is a phenomenon rooted in social trauma. We'll work with that a little bit. And what do we know about how the transformation happens from social trauma or collective trauma to domestic violence? And when people are working on the front lines with folks who have experienced violence, how does it affect advocates? What's the impact of secondary trauma? And how do brains impacted by trauma try to cope? What tools do we know about that begin to heal trauma and restore brains that have interfaced with trauma in any form, directly or anecdotally from stories and reports? I am very much enjoying the addition of, I mean, enjoying is an odd word, but the addition of adverse community environments to the adverse childhood experiences list. As you may be well aware, Vincent Folletti was the man who developed the ACEs study, and he really focused on the adverse childhood experiences. The initial folks who were included in that study, the 17,000, were largely college educated, many of them white. And so not only do we see the impact of specific traumas on children and their developing brains, but I'm very much relieved to see the inclusion of adverse community environments in this thoughtfulness, including poverty, discrimination, community disruption, as we'll be seeing community disruption being hugely important, lack of opportunity, economic mobility, and social capital, poor housing quality and affordability, and violence. And just holding, as I have been in preparing this presentation, the impact of COVID-19 as community disruption and lack of opportunity, and leading to many problems with housing and violence, poverty. So when we start to look at the way that domestic violence has its roots in the past and travels from generation to generation, becoming transgenerational trauma, then we begin to understand that the root of all transgenerational trauma is collective trauma entering and impacting the family system. I just wanted to be explicit that there is difficult material here about abuse as a result of collective trauma, and particularly sexual abuse. So one definition of collective or communal trauma, which I like very much, is traumatic experiences shared by large groups of people who share some of the psychological, cultural, physical, spiritual, social, and mental distresses that result. Everyone experiences traumatic loss, grief, and bereavement when they are exposed to violent devastation and death. It's difficult to avoid. In a way, the exposure to violence can be seen as something like what we're learning about the COVID-19 virus itself, that if you get a little bit, you can metabolize it. And if you get a great deal of the virus, then you're going to get very much sicker. And people function this way with violence and loss as well. If they get a little bit, they can survive it. If it's unending, then it's very difficult to metabolize, which is why we need each other. Because with each other, we can actually metabolize and continue to find the strange moments of joy that are a part of the complexity of life together. We really can't do it alone. In the face of collective trauma, people tend to withdraw. And here we have an experience with COVID-19 where we're putting everybody into their houses all by themselves. So not only do we have a human tendency to withdraw in the face of collective trauma, we're exacerbating it with our public policies, which are saving lives. There's a complexity here. It's not just one thing. Each layer of trauma reduces community resilience and community healing. So here we are, not attending our churches or our social organizations or our bowling clubs or our singing clubs. Here we are having little contact with our neighbors, having some contact with friends, having contact with parents or family perhaps, and having contact with our children. But each of these layers of connection creates community resilience and the possibility for accompaniment and community healing. And our non-resonant or ineffective systemic responses can add another layer to this trauma. In this cartoon, it's Black America being killed, white America being blind, which is a very non-resonant and ineffective systemic response. If we can't see what's happening, then we can't actually take action. We can't receive the feedback that the system is out of whack. It's very important. Collective trauma seeps slowly and insidiously into the fabric and soul of relations and beliefs of people as community. And Samuel Jackson in 2011 in the New York Times, speaking about implicit, buried racism. People know about the Klan and the overt racism, but the killing of one's soul little by little, day after day, is a lot worse than someone coming in your house and lynching you. When the physical space of a home or place is violated, the boundaries of a group's moral space can collapse. Feelings of distress, unexpressed rage, and helplessness may then be expressed through violence. After the bombing in Oklahoma City, for example, it was shown that alcohol and other drugs, drug misuse, suicides, homicides, and violence against women and children increased substantially for a period of about 18 months within the city. When the grassy Narrows Reserve in Canada was poisoned by mercury in the 1960s by a paper-making company, and the indigenous people were forcibly removed. Sexual assault, child neglect and abuse, petrol sniffing, and death through violence became epidemic. Men beat women and abused children. Women discarded infants and abused children. Older children beat and abused younger children. Hierarchies of power abuse and misdirected pain and anger were expressed in community violence. Collective trauma became personal and abuse became transgenerational. Your family has also carried collective pain into your family system. And where we see it becoming personal is that convergence, the movement from adverse community environments into adverse childhood experience, where we have these high numbers that you are very familiar with. Trauma makes us 4 times more likely to become an alcoholic, 4 times more likely to inject drugs, 3 times more likely to have to struggle with depression, 15 times more likely to commit suicide. So just take a moment to consider in your own family history, where has collective trauma impacted your family and your family system? Consider war, military conflict, and military service, fathers, uncles, grandfathers, great-grandfathers. The Great Depression, famine. Those of us who have any Irish ancestry were most likely to have left Ireland on due to in the 1800s due to the potato famine, the Great Famine there. Other places in Europe that had tremendous famines that you might consider include Scandinavia, which in the 1800s had terrible famines, as did Poland, Ukraine, Western Russia. The famine was so bad in Western Russia that cannibalism was common.
Ugh.
Mass shootings, domestic terrorism, family separations, genocide. Many, not just the Holocaust, but many genocides in the 20th century. Religious persecution and confiscation of property, livelihood, religious killings and pogroms. The folks who immigrated from Eastern Europe who were Jewish were most likely not leaving famine, but leaving the genocidal and institutionalized terrorism by Cossacks who were used by the Russian Federation to expand their borders into Eastern Europe. Enslavement, natural and environmental disaster, loss of land, migration. Most of us who have any white genetic contribution in North America were migrants at some point. Forced migration. This is a picture from the partition in India. Internment. Americans of Japanese, German, and Italian ancestry during World War II. And of course, COVID-19 impacting us now and impacting the people you work with and the people you care about. All of these collective traumas move into families and become abuse, neglect, mental illness, addiction, and abandonment. Just so we can all take a breath because that's all big. We're going to actually do a breakout and put you in to be able to touch some of this, whatever's been arising in you with the cumulative understanding that may be coming. But let's take a look before we go there to healing collective trauma so that we have a sense not just of the enormity that everybody's been impacted by, but what are some of our roads out? Acknowledgement. Acknowledging the systemic intrusion of collective trauma. Those of us who have lived through mental illness, a childhood abuse, may find it very difficult to even think of our families kindly, but sometimes it can be helpful to acknowledge the ways in which our families in past generations were impacted by collective trauma. Ritual. Mourning together. Coming to nature for connection. And constellation work, which is something I love, family constellation work, working with the traumas of past generations and how they impact us. And then our resonant language skills also help us as we're beginning to turn our clear vision both towards the root causes of the violence that's a part of everyone's life. And as we begin to want to be able to step into creating community together that's very effective and warm in terms of holding this with one another instead of all alone. What I'd like you to do is to be able to speak about how your bodies are doing. So Mercedes and I are going to put you into breakout groups of 4. This will give you choice. You'll be given a choice about whether to go. It'll say now or later, or yes and later. If you don't want to be in a breakout group, just push later. It won't pull you in later. It's a way to say no. And what I'd like you to do is in the group to be able to honor how our bodies are responding to this information. So how does your body respond to collective trauma at the systemic or personal level? And then you're also going to be interested in this exploration. How does resonance affect you? How does it affect you and your body to know that you aren't alone? So the first person who's willing to go, you will think about how your family has been impacted by collective trauma. And this is so far nonverbal. Step 1 is nonverbal. Just notice how your body responds and remember how it is responding. Now tell your group or your dyad, however many people are there, 3 to 4 sentences about the impact of collective trauma on your family. And you notice your body when you're speaking, but don't speak about your body sensations yet. And then the group will do something very peculiar, which is not something we usually do. And so, for example, Mercedes, will you do this with me? If I speak about my body sensations, then you'll just respond with what happens. I'm not going to speak about my body sensations. I'm going to speak about the impact of collective trauma. And you'll just notice what happens in your body and you'll tell me. So I would say the impact of collective trauma on my family includes the famine in the Ukraine and the famine in Ireland that comes on both sides. And in particular, my father's family, with the close connection to the Irish famine, was so cruel to their children that it was almost levels of cruelty that were almost psychopathic. And then I just noticed how my body does speaking about this. And Mercedes now says what happens in her body and asks me, is it anything like that for you?
What happened in my body is that I felt an oppression in my chest when I heard about what you experienced with your family and about the history in your family. And I feel something in my tummy, like, is any of that?
Thank you. It's so helpful. It really settles me and makes me really notice now this sort of barking tears that are in my eyes. So I respond with how my body's responding in response to what Mercedes says. And I may say something about how it was at the beginning and then what's changed. And so I noticed like an agitation in my chest that settled when Mercedes spoke about something, vibration here. So this is a very simple exercise, but quite profound because it gives us something to do that lets people know we're in the game and we're with them, even when it's really big. And it's very simple, and it's not, we don't have to fix anything, we don't have to know anything. All we need is just to notice what's happening in our own bodies. So if you'd like to try this out, we're going to give you 12 minutes. Mercedes, are we more or less ready to go?
Yes, we are.
Okay.
And
Okay.
I want to ask people that put later in the chat box, you will have the option. You are going to be moved to the breakout room, but you have the option to go back to the main room. Okay?
Oh, very good.
And I will keep an eye on you. So I am going to open the rooms now.
Thank you, Mercedes.
Sarah, there are a
Yeah.
couple of messages, and some of the common comments are very visual, visceral experience of the collective pain. Glad to share space with my breakout partner.
Oh, very good. Very, very good. Thank you, Mercedes. I'm grateful to all of you and grateful to you for putting your appreciations of one another in the chat, because that's so supportive of warmth and community.
There is one more person that would like to share.
Oh, yes, please.
Elaine, you can unmute yourself.
Hi, Sarah. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hello, Elaine.
Thank you. First, thank you so much for your gift already. Our group was a very amazing group. And I just wanted to say to them and to you, it was a very healing thing for all three of us.
Oh,
I believed as we shared our body connections, our responses that way, we felt not only connected in the pain and trauma and sorrow, grief, but the hope and the joy that it brought us also.
Yes, it's so surprising.
Yes.
Even with these massive historical
It was amazing. Yes, it was a very wonderful thing. So I thank you deeply for your work.
I'm so grateful to hear it. Thank you very much, Elaine. Makes me happy. All right, I will go back to the slides. So when we use the word social trauma, we can be referring to either collective trauma that's entering our systems from historical events, or to systemic traumas that are sort of the adverse community environments that become long ingrained as a result of collective traumas. Systemic trauma including hunger, housing, violence, poverty, education questions, and racism and other isms. And next time we come together, we'll be talking about oppression, the effects of oppression, and healing steps to take in the face of oppression, like racism and microaggressions. So we'll touch on that together the next time. But today we'll focus less on the systemic and more on the impact of collective. And it's very important to understand what trauma does in the brain. Personal impacts of systemic and collective trauma can stick in our memories and disrupt our default mode networks. What the heck is a default mode network? A default mode network is a system in the brain. Our whole brain runs in big interdependent systems called networks. And these are a little like the bus lines in a city, where you can get on the number 10 bus and it goes to some of the same places as the number 12 bus, but they diverge and have other routes end up in different places, start different places. And that's true for our brains as well. So our brains run in these big networked systems. And we do use the different networks to do different things. So we perceive our vision, or we focus our attention, and the visual network is what comes alive when we're looking around. So just take a moment and notice the colors in your room and the shapes of things. And we've got your visual network activated in this moment. And now you can take a moment to imagine that you're playing hide and seek with a child, and you're looking for a good place to hide. So now you're using your brain in a different way. Could you fit under the bed? I don't think I would fit under the bed. I'd have to go under these pile of cushions that are over here and hide inside of the blankets. So that's using our brain in a different way. That's the dorsal attention network, which is kind of like, how are we in the environment? How can we use the environment physically? So the dorsal attention network is very different, as you see in this sheet. In this slide, the default mode network is the one in the middle here, and we've only begun to learn about it. You don't know yet. Let me keep going here for a moment. So here again, the default mode network versus the focused visual attention network. We'll step into the default mode network in a moment, but before we do, I'd like you to know a little about it. It's a brain system that supports integration of self with the social world. It connects the brain parts for self, others, memory, and planning. And it automatically integrates our social world with our sense of self. Our default mode network is what we use when we're ruminating. So when we're worrying and worrying and worrying about something, that's our default mode network, running the same thoughts over again and over again. And when the default mode network is untroubled by stress and trauma, it's what we use for daydreaming and creativity and remembering that today is Aunt Agatha's birthday and tracking what's happening with our children or our partners or our friends. So when the default mode network is working to our benefit, then it's where we do our daydreaming. It's where we remember what has happened, we realize what we've forgotten, we think about the future, we imagine different scenarios, we think about why people do what they do. When it's working to our benefit, we think about why people do what they do with generosity and imagination. And it's also the home of our creative and integrative thought. But, and there's a picture of us living with a non-stress default mode network. It's doing all kinds of wonderful things. But when it's paining us, something different happens. Then we have uncontrollable mind wandering, self-criticism and suspicion of others, relentless self-reproach and thoughts of the injuries others have done to us, anxiety about the future and about others, intrusion of painful memories. It can be hard to stay focused, and we can have nightmares, and that's where our nightmares and night terrors live. So when we're stressed, the default mode network worries about our problems endlessly. But when we're traumatized, then all of a sudden, the default mode network can turn very nasty indeed. And this is something that our clients and that our friends may struggle with, any kind of self-hate or self-recrimination, critical self-witness. So what is this default mode network? It's what the brain does with itself when we haven't given it anything else to do. So it's most active, we'll usually notice it the most in our busy lives when we wake up in the morning, when we're doing dishes, when we're driving long distances and CD player's broken, when we're falling asleep at night, what would I say, in the shower. These are all times when you may notice the voice of your default mode network. the DMN is active on the first day of an infant's life, probably active in the womb, but they haven't done that, looking for that in the MRIs of a pregnant lady. Comes online with as little as 1 second of downtime from intentional external use of the brain. The scientists found this because they were having people be in MRI machines and do algebra problems. And then they noticed that there was white noise, what they called white noise, in between each algebra problem. They were like, here the brain just has static, like an empty radio channel. And about 10 years in of looking at this static all over the world, the scientists went, aha, there's something happening here, which we thought was static, but is actually the brain integrating itself with its social world, because we are immensely social. And when we pay some attention to something external, the DMN mostly stops working. But first-person shooter video gaming most completely deactivates the default mode network. Now, the DMN is where our anxiety lives. So folks who are compulsively gaming are managing a DMN, which is really probably anxious and unpleasant to live with. So if you have a young man in your life, or an older person of any gender, of course, women as well, and theys as well, all genders, a person in your life who's compulsively gaming, you can make a very good guess that the inside of their brain is not a good place to live. And my whole focus of my work is making the inside of our brains a good place to live. So if this is interesting you, the book that Mercedes mentioned, Your Resonant Self, is just a very good place to start. And the website, yourresonantself.com, has free downloads of meditations and so on. So it's a resource. Nicotine also turns off the DMN and makes us pay more attention with our eyes. As we age, the DMN becomes more intrusive. You may have noticed that. You think you know what you're going to go into the next room for, and you get in there and you're suddenly just standing there going, what the heck did I come for? Your DMN has taken over. You've started thinking about something else and you've lost whatever that thought was that originally brought you into the room. In ADHD, the DMN spontaneously takes over the brain. In depression, the DMN runs on rumination and brooding instead of our creative daydreaming. And the self-critical default mode network says to us things like, I'm too much, I'm not enough, I'm fat, I'm ugly, I'm clumsy, I'm dumb, I'm lazy, there's something wrong with me, I'm not as smart as anyone else, I don't belong, I don't matter, my voice doesn't matter, my brain doesn't work, I never get it right. So we're going to have a little group experience in this moment. We're going to be silent without meditating or distracting our brain with input for just 1 minute. We're just going to be silent. And notice, don't meditate. Just don't think of algebra problems. Just let your brain do what it does in a quiet moment so that you can begin to experience this. Okay. Now take a moment. We'll stop the share so I can see the chat as well. And write into the chat. Um, write into the chat what you noticed that your brain did. Yes, the default mode network often asking, am I doing this right? Very, very characteristic of our default mode networks, trying to take care of us, trying to make sure that we're doing things right. Started thinking about work, what I have to, the planning, notice the planning. My brain became very aware of all the external sounds around me. Noticing the external environment. I'm on future thinking. What is on my schedule today? Calm and empty. I began thinking about the rest of my day because I'm getting a new kitty. What have you done and what should you do? Planning, look for something to read or do, quiet then distracted by sound. What I need to do, unrealistic expectations, what has been bothering me lately, perfect. So we're starting to really touch in here to a sense of what people's brains do when they're quiet. They do a range of things from being peaceful to not being very peaceful at all. Looking at the trees, playing a song in my head. So here we are with our brains, concern for others' well-being, very characteristic of our DMN. Yeah. Thank you for being willing to hop into that experiential moment with me and getting acquainted with the inside of our own brains and what the insides of our own brains do can be quite lovely. It used to be torture, sheer torture for me. It's why I'm doing what I do in the world. The inside of my brain was not a nice place to live. It was a place that mostly would have liked death rather than living, because being alive was so exhausting, because the inside of my brain was such an exhausting place to live. So what I'm here to sort of testify to is the incredible capacity of our brains for neuroplasticity, and the parts of our brains that change with self-warmth practices and resonance practices are the very parts of our brains that are most amenable to change, that are most happy to change. So I'll come back to the slides now. Oh, and Inger has shared reality with me. My brain was not a good place in the world previously too. Sweetness to have that difference. Okay. So now I'd like to speak to you a little about resonance. It's very important, especially when we're with violence and domestic violence and systemic difficulties. It's hugely important for us to for us to learn not to leave ourselves alone. And we can learn all kinds of resonant language skills, resonant skills that help us be with ourselves and help us be with others. And speaking about body sensations is one of the very first skills. You've already learned a resonant language skill today. And the reason that it's important to know what resonance is because it actually takes us into a fluid place. The brain has two hemispheres, and we'll look more closely at the hemispheres next time. But for now, suffice it to say that we have a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. Our left hemisphere is our get things done hemisphere, and it doesn't change. It's not a changeable, fluid, responsive place. So if we give somebody advice, then nothing changes in their body, because we're coming from the instrumental brain. If we begin to move into the kinds of language that research shows light up the right hemisphere, body sensations being one of them, then we start to move into the fluid space of healing, where the traumas will no longer be lodged in our bodies. When we bring our perception to focus on another person, this is attunement. It's like we're inviting ourselves to tune into them, as if we were a radio that had this capacity to find another person's channel. At this point, we may begin to have empathy or compassion for the person that we're tuning into. If I bring my attention to Mercedes and I'm just wondering from over here without even asking her how she's doing, then I'm having empathy and compassion, but Mercedes will not even know that I have that connection with her. Attunement, empathy, and compassion can all be generated and sustained by one person. But resonance requires communication, verbal or nonverbal. Resonance is only possible in a two-person system, minimum of 2 people. And accompaniment starts to happen when one person consents to let another travel with them, emotionally or physically. When we say yes to each other, we're starting to tell each other that we are entering resonance and engagement. If I ask Mercedes, Mercedes, are you in this moment? I wonder if you are experiencing interest and care, and if your attention is so split between making sure everybody's more or less okay and enjoying the material and worrying about other stuff. Is it anything like that for you?
Yes, it is exactly that.
Uh-huh. So Mercedes and I have an implied consent because we enjoy each other so much. So I forgot to ask even consent for using her in this moment. But when I made my wondering and she said yes, then we know that Mercedes and I are in a resonant field where there is some mutual sense of one another. And it's of course, when we get those yeses, we know, oh, we're in a resonant field. It lets us know that accompaniment is welcome. So teens can sometimes it can sometimes be difficult to tell with teens whether or not our accompaniment is welcome, for example. And so here's why resonance and accompaniment are so important. Oh, let's see. We're running a little behind, so I'll just do this with somebody who's willing to do this with me. I'll do it as a demo, and then we'll come back. Is there somebody who's, what I would love is somebody who's willing to speak with me for a moment and who's willing to experience me doing 2 things. One is to offer reassurance, it's going to be okay. And the other is to move more towards resonance. So is there somebody who has something they can feel in their body that just needs to be touched on and held together, who's willing to be either voice or picture on the video to work with me? And Andrea, it looks like Andrea has volunteered. Okay, Andrea, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm feeling just like heaviness in the chest, like tightness.
And now I'll do the reassurance and just notice what happens with your chest. Andrea, it's going to be okay. You'll get through this. Just notice what happens with the heaviness. And now we'll come back to resonance. Just tell me again about the chest.
It's still tight, but it's a little bit better, like a little bit of lifted. It's still pretty tight, and it's moving a little bit towards my tummy.
Would it be sweet if somebody understood how difficult what's going on is for you?
I guess, I'm not sure. It's just the feeling is really just tight.
Do we know, and I'll ask just another couple questions, if it's okay with you.
Okay.
Do we know anything about why it's tight?
I feel like there's a little bit of like anxiousness. I'm not sure where it's coming from.
So I wonder if like it's almost even bewildering or a little confusing to find this sensation in your body and not even know where it comes from.
Yeah, it's kind of confusing.
Yeah. And what happens for it? What happens with the sensation now?
It's almost gone, honestly. It's still there, like lingering, I would say. But a while ago, it was extremely tight.
Oh,
and
wow.
now it's given some way, I guess, to let go a little bit.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrea, for stepping into this with me.
Thank you as well for
very
letting
grateful.
me experience this.
Yeah, yeah. So, what we got to do with Andrea is we got to experience, first of all, there's a wonderful power in warmth. We're not dissing warmth in any way, and I'll come back to the slide here so that you can get a little bit of a sense of what Andrea and I were doing, that we were trying out reassurance where Andrea says, I have a sensation in my chest, and I respond with warmth. It's going to be okay. Then there's a little bit of settling, but there's not a big change. And then we move more into resonance. And in the resonance, something starts to shift. We're moving into the relational space where body sensations change in response to accompaniment. And where there's some a wonderful all-purpose question, which is the one that I shared with Andrea. Would it be sweet? You can see it 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 dots down. Whoops. It says, would it be sweet if someone else understood how hard this is? It's a very gentle question that lets your conversational partners know that you are in your right hemisphere with them. So it's one I'll invite you to take home and try out with somebody. Sometimes I ask the question, do you need acknowledgement of how hard this is? And sometimes I ask the question, would it be sweet if someone else understood how hard this is? I love being asked about an acknowledgement. I have such huge needs for acknowledgement, but I was working in Ireland and the whole room preferred, would it be sweet if someone else understood how hard it is? So you get to take this away and do it on your own. Next week, we'll be looking at oppression. And I'd like to just come out and see if there are any questions before we come to an end.
Sarah,
Yes.
I think that it would be useful clarification. There is a comment from Jessica about my concern with saying it is going to be okay is that it can be dismissive. And at the end of the day, we actually don't know if things are going to be okay. I avoid saying things like this to the BSA survivors.
It's beautiful, absolutely. Yeah, that's the we live in a world that gets by on it's going to be okay because at least it's got warmth. And we may have lived lives that are very low on warmth, but my entire desire is to have other options to be able to speak with people who are living in very difficult situations, still be able to talk and still be able to bring ourselves and to know that sometimes we are so helpless to be able to help in any way besides accompaniment. Yeah. I would like to tell a small story that takes us into the power of resonance. It's a domestic violence, an experience with a woman who had lived through domestic violence. I was working in a midwifery college, and the women were all in their 20s, and sometimes they even had their babies with them. They had given birth and they had newborns with them. And this young woman had a newborn with her, and she came up and spoke to me on a break, and she said, I have a sense that my brain is stuck in time. When I look at my 3-year-old son's face, when he's angry, I think it's my ex-husband. And I said, what was the worst moment with your ex-husband? And she said, oh, it was the night the police were called. And I said, oh, well, let's just go to you and we'll do a little time travel resonance for you in this evening when the police were called. Well, what's the moment we're traveling to? And she said, we're traveling to the moment when he was kicking me and the police were breaking down the door. And I said, let's stop everything. We need to stop everything. We're going to turn your ex-husband to dust for this moment. And we're just going to make sure that this young you is okay. And so I said, how's she doing? And she said, she just wants to know that her baby's okay. And I said, is this the little guy that's 4 years old now? And she said, yeah, this is the one. I said, oh, you can tell her through time and space that your baby's okay. And she said, oh, I'm standing up. I'm so strong. And I said, oh, does she want to come home with you? Does she want to know that this man is now your ex-husband and that things are better now, that you have a new husband and is he a sweet husband? And she said, yes, my new husband is very sweet. And so we just brought her past self back through time and space to be in the present moment. And then I said to her, what's it like to imagine your son's angry face right now? And she said, oh, he looks like me too. He's just an angry little boy. I wonder what he's so angry about. And we stayed in contact for some months after this moment, and she let me know that the change was stable, that it didn't go back to the little boy looking like her ex-husband. So this is a beautiful example that we were working in present moment with each other today, but we can also work through time and space to be with each other in even the most difficult moments. So that's what I'd like to leave you with for today, is the sweetness of resonance and the ways that our brains so need accompaniment. And Mercedes, is there anything you'd like to say in closing?
Thank you, Sarah. Oh, beautiful session. Thank you so much. And I want to remind everyone that you will be back with us in 2 weeks, which is in June 5th. And we will be sending recording and materials. And would you mind giving your website address?
Sure, I'll put it in the chat. Oops, that's to Adriana personally. Hold on a moment. Everyone. There we go.
Wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah. And then the website for the recordings, which also have Mercedes reading the meditations in Spanish.
In Spanish, yeah.
Yes. And those are also on Insight Timer. They're just beautiful. Yeah.
Thank you. It will be the same link for next time, and you don't need to register again.
Very good.
I will send a reminder a few days before this session. And thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Mercedes.
Really a beautiful session. I am so grateful for your presence with us. And thank you to everyone that joined.
Thank you. Thank you, Mercedes. It's an honor to be with you all. Thank you for doing the work that you do in the world.